@PlaysTogether on the forums. Welcome you to the meetup. It's great to see everybody out here. We got a record attendance this time. I got Steve Jakab here, one of our senior engineers. Hello. Going to be doing a presentation in just a minute. We got Jonathan in the back corner, our senior game designer, and Tan over here in the corner, which you can't see, he's off camera. One of our founders and lead web developer. We got some who braves the cold here in Texas, which is not cold necessarily if you're in Ohio or in Iowa, but cold enough for Texas. So we thank you for coming out. So we're going to be talking about networking. I know some people have come to talk about graphene or ask questions. I'll field questions after the presentation, after the Q&A for the presentation. I'll field questions. I may not be able to answer a lot of them. We're not speaking publicly about a lot of details, but I will field what I can. And Tam may be able to field something as well if I can. All right. Well, after this poll, if you want to, we done with the poll, Tam?
Waiting for it to hit 70% to make sure people are paying attention.
All right. So answer the poll, and then we will start the presentation.
I think I only need one more person to answer the poll. So if you haven't yet, or when 2 minutes pass.
Yeah.
We're 2 minutes past.
Tick.
So we'll try this time schedule out. We moved it to Thursday, and then of course there's possible meetup conflict here in town, but we'll just play it by ear and see how things go.
So there are no either you're pro or you just don't want to talk about it.
All right. Well, Steve's going to talk about PlaysTogether and networking. Unfortunately, we don't have the server we're still doing maintenance on, so we don't have a live demo for you guys tonight. But I'll let Steve take it away and show you guys about networking and play with PlaysTogether.
Okay, yeah, as Alan said, I had hoped to have an actual live demo going today, but unfortunately we were having some problems with the servers this week, and so that wasn't able to be finished. So instead we have a slideshow presentation in which we'll go over kind of the basic functionality of PlaysTogether. Now, it's not we're not going to go over everything because there's a lot of stuff you can do in it. But we'll go over the basic functionality to be able to create a multiplayer game. First of all, we should talk about what PlaysTogether actually is and what kind of things you can do with it. It allows you to make turn-based asynchronous multiplayer games. So it's going to be every player has a turn, and everybody takes their turn one at a time. It's not, you can't do a game like Rochambeau, where everybody's taking their turn simultaneously. You can't make a massively multiplayer game or a fighting game where everybody's doing something simultaneously. It's more for things like if you wanted to emulate a board game, you could do that with this system. Or if you want to do something like Words with Friends, you would be able to do that with this system. You can have a maximum of 8 players. In theory, we could increase that, but that's kind of a decent compromise because we have to create a table for every player, and we have to do that ahead of time. So if we supported 32 players, we'd have to create 32 tables, one for each player, even though your game might only have two players. And so that's a lot of data that's wasted. So 8's decent. And frankly, probably most multiplayer games will have 8 or less players anyway. Most of them will actually probably just have 2. One thing that's very good about the PlaysTogether system is that no dedicated server is needed. Unlike the other multiplayer system that GameSolid supports, you don't actually need a server to run commands. That means that on the GameSolid side, there's a lot more things you have to do because there's a lot more commands rather than just simply get and send data. But on the plus side, you don't actually have to have your own computer running your own server, and you have to worry about writing server code and all that. However, the downside is that on our side, on the PlaysTogether side, no code is actually run. The PlaysTogether system is basically a giant database. and it simply takes data that you send it and sends it over to other players. So if you want to do something like verify that someone isn't cheating, you have to do that in your game. You can't have a server test to make sure the data is good. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind when designing a multiplayer game. And it will be available for Mac and Windows Creator 0.13 when they come out. It's been available on Mac Creator and the 90 builds for some time now. And we're just spinning up Windows to version 1.2, and we will be adding it to Windows 1.3 when that comes out. I think that's it there. By the way, if you have any questions about the talk as it's going on, please ask them when it comes up, so that we don't have to, go back and try to remember.
And then also, you can raise your hand too in this. If you raise your hand, if you need an audio, if you want to speak, we can unmute you as well.
Okay. So the first thing you need to do when setting up a multiplayer game is sign up on the PlaysTogether site so you can register yourself as a developer and actually create the backend for your game. The web address is developer.playstogether.com, and you'll see a login here, and you can sign up, and it'll have sign up information, and you'll enter in, when you go to log in, you enter in your username, which is actually your email address, and your password, and log in. What you want to do is this is the first screen you hit when you log in. What you want to do is you want to hit create a new game. And you see this information here, DAU, MAU, new players. All this is basically demo data, effectively. This data isn't actually hooked up to the game yet. We need to modify the servers and the web servers so that this actually provides good information. But for now, just ignore the stuff on my developer dashboard. That's all in beta right now, and it's just dummy data that's being shown. So as you're testing your game, the stuff you're seeing won't be reflected on here. When we get to release, this will be working. But what you want to do is click on the New Game button, and you will go to a screen like this. And the middle section here, the highlighted section here, is stuff you want to fill in. There's the game name, and that's basically to just identify it on the back-end side, on the website. You won't actually need this for your game on Games on site. Game description, you can type in anything here. It's just to remind yourself what the game is. It's not used. The important part, however, is the active. If this is clicked to yes, your game will be available and you will be able to talk to the server. If it's set to no, when you try to connect to the server, you'll get an error back saying, I can't connect. Someone says, can't we see the slides?
Let's find out more information.
Yes, somebody not being able to see the slides.
Is anyone having trouble seeing the screen?
I see on mine.
I see this on the video. Oh, make the.
It's more like a presentation after the fact, like seeing the slides online.
I see screen and video. Okay, somebody.
Yep.
Actually, if no one minds, I am going to turn off the video. You have to turn off the video.
Yeah, I was going to say. They want me so they can see it bigger. Yeah, for some reason it's showing really small. I feel like that, though. Well, I can zoom in. They can also, you can do.
Yeah, that won't
zoom anything. I can zoom it here, but the problem is it's something on your machine.
On my machine?
Yeah, somehow it's. There we go. So
it's like I can see it fine from here too, so I think it's. Oh, are you showing only the window? Oh, well, we're seeing what your screen is. So.
Yeah. I'm hitting play on the preview or on the demo thing, so. Yeah, this is the size that it's showing it as. For some reason, it's not showing it full screen. I'm sure.
Let's just try to. Can everyone see? Let's see. Can everyone see it now?
Yeah, zoom. Use the zoom feature there if you need to go in bigger.
Okay. Are we good?
All right, people are trying to see it. So.
Okay.
All right.
So let me go back here. So this is the login on PlaysTogether. As you see, developer.playstogether.com. So you log in, go to create a new game on the left-hand side. Click on that. And then enter in the game name and set the game to active. Like I said, the game description is just for your own reminder. It's not shown anywhere, and you don't need it anywhere in GameSalad. The stuff below that, the property name, property value, all that is not actually used by our system in GameSalad. It's part of the PlaysTogether, but it's not actually part of the back end of the PlaysTogether, but it's not actually used in GameSalad's interface to it, so you don't have to worry about that stuff. Once you create your game, you'll be shown to you'll be able to click on the game on the left-hand side here. So here's tic-tac-toe up on the upper left. And you will get to a screen that is supposed to show you basically how many people are playing your game. Again, this is all dummy data, so don't pay attention to it. But there is one thing you do have to pay attention to, and that's the game key. You're going to want to copy that down, or just cut and paste it. You're going to be wanting to copy it and cut and paste it into GameSalad when you create your project on the GameSalad side. The other thing you want to note is the account button in the upper right-hand corner here, because there's values that you're going to be wanting there. So once you get the game key, you want to click on Account, and you'll see a screen like this. And you want to get the developer private key and the developer public key. The game key, the private key, and the public key will all be needed to set up your game on GameSalad Creator. So once you've set up your game and you've set it to active and you've got the 3 keys, you can go into GameSalad and start working on your game. So here we are. Once you've logged in, and make sure you do log in, because multiplayer with PlaysTogether is for pro only, so you need to log into it so the creator knows you're pro. When you create a new project, you will see the multiplayer drop down at the bottom of the project info. You want to select Together Games as the option there, and it will show a private, public, and game key entry. And what you're going to do is enter the keys that were on the PlaysTogether site into those three entries. Yeah, log in as pro, set the multiplayer value to Together Games, and enter in the 3 keys, the public, private, and game key that you got from the PlaysTogether website. And that will let your game communicate with the server and make sure that the data you're getting is for that particular game. Now, if you decide to create multiple games, you can do that with just the same user login, and your private and public key will be the same for you over however many games you decide to create. The only thing that will change will be the game key. So just keep that in mind if it's useful. So once you create once you set up the multiplayer to Together Games, a bunch of data is actually created for you by us. There's several tables, a bunch of new attributes, and there's also some functions. One thing to note is that because GameSalad doesn't have the ability to filter functions based on pro or not, the functions exist whether you're logged in or pro or not. However, they are basically useless unless you actually are running a network game. So we can go over some of these very quickly, and we'll get into more detail as we go through the talk. The tables are basically the kind of the primary way you're going to communicate game information back and forth between the players. The network game instances is how you get a list of who's playing what game, and so that's how you can do matchmaking. The network game data is a table that basically has global game information. So the information is going to be shared and be able to be modified by all players. However, if you want game data that's only available to a particular player that only that player can modify, we also create players called network player game data _1, _2, _3, etc. up to 8. And those will only be available to be modified by the particular player that the table is assigned to, and we'll get to how they're assigned in a minute. We also have network player data table, and this is a data table that applies to that particular player over any game they play that you create. So, for instance, if you have several different games that you've created, and you want to keep track of, like, the counts, and you want to be able to have the user see, how many times they've played every single game of yours that they've got. You can actually store that data in that particular table, and no matter what game they're actually playing, they'll still get that data back. And network achievements, PlaysTogether has its own achievement system, which we will not be going into this talk. But you can use this table to see what achievements the players have gotten. One thing to note on network game data and network player data are both starred on the chart here. That means that you can actually create new tables and assign them as game data tables or player data tables, so you're not restricted to just a single table for your game data. You can create, however many tables you want, and in the table creation GUI, you can actually assign it as a game data table or a player data table, and it will be associated with that data and sent over the network when that data is sent over the network. You cannot do that with the table that's assigned to a specific player. Only one table exists for that. So you'll have to keep your data straight and decide how you want to lay out your data. The functions, there's basically two pairs of functions. One is to translate a player number, so player number 1, player number 2, player number 3, and get their network ID. Every player in a game has a specific network ID that is associated with them that basically tells the server who the player is. The server doesn't really care, this guy's player 1 or this guy's player 2. The server actually wants this player is ID, 10,687. And that player is going to be defined by that number. And so you can use the top two functions to get that player ID or player ID for the player number or vice versa. The bottom two functions are actually related to the network player game data _1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's how you actually find a particular table for a particular player. So you have, for instance, player number 1, and you know his ID. Then you can call network player table for ID, pass in that player's network ID, and it will return a reference to a table that's associated with that player. And then you can use that function anywhere in anything where you would use a table. So get table, set table cell, and they show different usernames has been fixed. No, that has not been fixed yet. We are still working on bug fixes. So I had hoped to actually announce that a lot of the known network bugs have been fixed by now. But unfortunately, as you know, the PlaysTogether website has been down for the past week or so. So I was unable to get that opportunity. But we will be fixing them soon. So yes, the bottom two bottom two are basically to get the network player game data for a particular player. The attributes go over very quickly. They're all under the game.networking. So if you're looking at the expression editor, you'll go to game. Under the game, there's a section called networking, and under that section, there are all these attributes. The game ID is the game currently being played. Player ID is the player who's actually on the device. Creator ID is the ID of the person that created the game. Player count is the number of players currently in the game. This may be less than the max number of players that can be in the game if not everyone has joined the game yet. So for instance, when the game is first created, player count will be 1. And then when the next player joins, player count will be 2, etc. until you hit the number of players that the game actually supports. Game started is just a flag saying, hey, the game is actually being played. Current player is the ID of the player whose turn is currently in. Current turn is a number saying which player is active, but it's essentially just an integer. It increases, starts at 1, and increases every time a player takes a turn. So the first player takes a turn will be 1. Next player takes a turn will be 2, and so on, and it basically just increases forever until the game's over. Current round increments when everybody's taking a turn. So if you have a 4-player game, current turn will start at 1, current round will start at 1, and then current turn will go 1, 2, 3, 4, and once it gets to 5, then current round will go to 2. So it's important to keep those straight if you're going to use those. That turn is per player, and round is for the entire group of players. Winner is the ID of the person that won the game once the game's over. Quitter is an interesting one. If someone decides to quit the game, that will be the ID of the person who quit. If multiple people quit the game essentially simultaneously, to get the list of them, you have to set quitter to 0. So what you're going to want to do is to have an actor with a behavior on it, basically just looking at quitter. And if it's not 0, you're going to want to display a message saying so-and-so has quit the game, and then they want to set quitter to 0. And so once it gets set to 0, it will keep track and say, oh, well, someone else has quit the game, and set that to the new player's value, and then you could pop up another message saying so-and-so has quit the game. Update rate is very, very important. PlaysTogether system is what we call a pull system, which means that the server basically just sits there. It never sends out data unless it's requested by the device the person is actually playing on. So update rate is how often the device requests data. So you basically want to set that as high as possible, and that's in seconds. So for instance, if it's 10, every 10 seconds, your game is going to go off to the server and say, give me the current state of the game. And then the server will send back all the data for the game. If you set that very fast, you're going to be flooded with network messages. So you basically want to set that as slow as possible so that your data stream doesn't get flooded, but fast enough so that your players aren't waiting a minute for updates. I would actually suggest to modify it depending on whether the person who's playing the game on the device is the current player or not. If the person is the current player, set it to a very low rate, because in general, the only messages that are going to be coming into the current player is if someone quits. Other than that, because this is a turn-based system, the current player won't be getting data from other players in general, because he's the one that's actually going to be modifying the game at the time. If you're not the current player, then you want to set it to a faster rate, because you want to keep saying, has the data changed? Has the current player changed? And so you want to set it to a faster rate so that the person can find out sooner that they're the current player, for instance, or the game state has changed. So that's actually kind of important. Set it when the update rate is, or when the current player is the player ID, set it to like 30 seconds, something really slow. But if you're not the current player, then set it to maybe something like 5 or 10 seconds, so you get updates fairly frequently. Message from and message are used for the messaging system. You can make sort of like a chat system. However, we will not be going over that in this talk. Connected is basically just a flag that says the network is up. So if connected ever gets set to false, then your game has lost connection to the server, and you should basically pop up a message saying something's gone wrong, and take them back to the beginning of the game. Last error is an error code that is set when you make a network call and something goes wrong. We won't go over the particular values, but they should be on the website somewhere, I believe. On
which ones?
The error codes, I believe, either that or they may be just in the initial post, but we should have them up somewhere. And the last server time is used. There's a behavior where you can ask the server what time it is. So you can have a common time between all your players, because you may have one player in, does the update go on while the game is off? No, we do not have push notifications or anything like that. So basically, once the player is not actually playing the game, they will not be getting any messages. So that is something we plan on adding in the future, but does not exist right now. So on last server time, basically, that's where that value gets set, so that you can say, "Hey server, what time do you have?" And then when it returns, last server time will be set to whatever the server time is. And you essentially can't use that as a absolute value, but you can use it for relative values. So you call last server time, and it says 5, and then you call last server time again, and it says 10. You know that 5 seconds have passed since between the two calls. But you don't want to use it for an absolute time. So that's kind of the data. Now we are going to go to setting up your game. So generally, when you set up your game, you're going to be wanting to set up various tables. And some of the tables may be overwritten, and some of them may not. First of all, some things that you don't want to modify at all are the network player game data X tables. Those will be initialized in a different way. So basically, you just leave those alone. They'll be initialized essentially at runtime when the players are actually playing. You do not want to initialize networking instances. That gets initialized from the server when you request a list of games that are being played. And you don't want to update network achievements. That also gets updated by the server when you request achievement data. There are some things you do want to modify, and whether they get modified later or not depends on the game. But in general, you want to modify network game data and my network game table. So any tables that you personally create that you assign as game data tables. You can modify those, when you're creating your game to set up your initial game state when a new game is created. You can modify the player data tables, so the player data table that we create for you, and any ones that you create for yourself. You can modify those, although in general, all you want to do is set the columns. Because what's going to happen is that when the player logs in, if any data exists on the server for those tables, they'll be updated from the server. And so they're really only useful for the initial state. And the other thing you're going to want to initialize is a table you create yourself, which I call my player initialization table here. This is basically going to be assigned to the network player game data X tables. So that, and we'll get to that, but what's going to happen is that the player will join the game for the first time, and my player initialization table will get copied to the network player game data underscore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that way you don't have to worry about, when my player joins, is he player 1 or player 5? And so which game data table do I have to initialize? We do that for you. So the first thing you're going to want to do as far as behaviors go in your game is called Network Connect. And you're going to want to do this with no parameters on the top 3 parameters. Because what happens is that when a player connects to your game in the PlaysTogether system, assuming they connect successfully, that data gets cached on their device. And so if you call Network Connect with no data in there, it will use that cached data. So they don't have to continually enter in their name and their email and their password every time. You do have to enter in a value for the callback attribute, and as a matter of fact, one thing you'll notice is that every single network command or behavior has a field called callback attribute. This works exactly the same way as a callback attribute in the new IAP system, if you're familiar with that, or it works the same way as the callback attribute in the server commands that where you run your own server. For those that aren't familiar with those, the callback attribute is an integer attribute. When the command is run, that value gets set to 0. And because that network commands are asynchronous, all these commands are going to basically just run, send some data to the server, and then immediately return. So that unlike most of your rules, which actually execute, and when you say animate, it starts animating right there and then, these actually don't execute completely until sometime in the future. And this callback attribute is basically telling you whether they executed successfully or not. So what's going to happen is that Network Connect is going to be called in this instance, and you're going to have a callback attribute here. When this thing is first run, that callback attribute will be set to 0, and the server eventually will come back and say that connect succeeded or failed. And if it succeeded, that callback attribute will be set to 1, and if it failed, that callback attribute will be set to -1. So what you're going to want to do is you want to, for every callback attribute, you're going to want to have a rule that's looking at the value, and it says, if it's set to 1, then it succeeded, and I'm going to do things where successful things happen. If it's set to -1, then something went wrong, and I'm going to do things to handle errors. So for game start, in this initial state, with these blank name, email, and password fields, first of all, the callback attribute returns 1, then they connected, everything's great, and you can just start going and start into your game. However, if it's -1, that's not necessarily a bad thing in this instance. Almost always, if callback attribute is -1, that means something bad happened. However, in this particular instance, not necessarily. What you want to do is look at game.networking.lastError. If that is less than or equal to -4, all that means is that they haven't logged in before. So that you need to basically take them to a login screen so that they can log in for the first time. If last error is greater than -4, that does mean something bad has happened. In general, it can't communicate with the server. In that case, you're just going to have to pop up a message saying, unable to communicate with server. If you have some sort of offline mode for your game, you can take them to there, or you'll just have to say, try again later. And also, in general, if something is wrong with the server, you should contact us because probably the server's gone down or we need to look at something. In general, the server should always be up. Although, as we saw last week, or this week, that's not always the case. So now we can go to the login screen. And here in the login screen, you're going to ask them for 3 pieces of data. You're going to ask your user for their player name, their player email, and player password, and you're going to call Network Connect again, but with that data in these fields. One thing that's set out that's actually very important for the PlaysTogether system is that players are identified individually by their email, not their name. So if they would log in with the same email but a different name, that's the same player as far as our system is concerned. Which means that you may be playing with Alan one day, and he may log off and log back in with the same email, but now call himself Steve, and also you're playing with Steve. And unfortunately, that's kind of just the way the system works, so that you don't necessarily want to make any data on your game associated with the player name. You can display the player name, but you don't want to ever have in your system where you cache off that name and then you compare it to something, because that name could change. Player's one name could change from one session to the next. Player password. One thing to note here is that currently we do have a command that lets the player change their password, but we don't have any way to let them recover their password if they forget it. We will be adding that in the future. However, currently, if the player forgets their password, they're going to effectively have to log in with a new email. Another thing to note is that we do not validate this email. We just use this as an identifier. So, the players, when they enter in their email, they're never going to get an email message from us saying, verify your login to this game, or anything like that. We use this strictly as an identifier. So once you call Network Connect with the player's data, what about the username and forgot password? Is that pointless? Currently, yes, it is pointless. If the user forgets their password, currently there is no way to recover it. We will be adding that in the future, but at the moment we can't. So if the callback attribute for Network Connect, when you actually pass in data, returns -1. Some useful information on last error might be -3, which is no server, which basically means that the server's gone down for some reason. If it's -4, you can pop up a message saying bad password. -4 basically means that they've logged in with this email before, but they logged in with a different password. And so you can say, wrong password, please enter it again, that kind of thing. In general, you should never get -5, because that basically means that they didn't enter in data. And in general, before you call Network Connect with the name, email, and password, you should verify that there's actually data in those fields. But if you don't, and they just say, log in, and they don't enter in any data, you'll get back a -5 on last error. Assuming there's a successful network connection, what's going to happen is that the server is going to send that player a bunch of data. And that data is going to be going into the network player data table, any network player tables that you create for your own game, and the network achievement table. So as soon as they log in, before they even connect to a game or start playing or anything, they're going to get their own personal data that's not game dependent, and they're going to get a list of all the achievements that they've successfully made. Although again, we're not going to go into how the achievements work. So in general, after you log in, what you want to do is you want to get the games that are being played. You either want to get the games the player is currently playing, so they can go in and continue playing a particular game, or you're going to want to get a list of games that are waiting for players to join the game. And here's how you do that. There's a command called NetworkGamelnstances. And you can use this for other things. For instance, you can use it to get the games that a player has finished. But we're just going to be going to kind of the general, the most used features of this function. So if you want to get a list of the players' current game, you want to make sure that 4-player, and I realize this is kind of small on the slide, but once we post them, you'll be able to magnify it and see it better. You want to make sure that 4-player is set to the current player's ID, which is game.networking.player_ID. That will make sure that any games listed will be for the current player. You're going to want to make sure that you set the in progress tick, and you may want to set the waiting for players box. Waiting for players basically means that the game isn't running, but it's still waiting for players. That's kind of up to you, and you definitely want to set the in progress bar, however. So that will make sure that he'll get the games that he's currently playing. If you want to just get a list of open games, you want to leave the 4-player blank, and you want to have the waiting for players box ticked, and the in progress option unticked, and that will get a list of games that are just waiting for other players to join. Other fields that are important: max games is going to be the max number of games that are returned. So, for instance, if you put in 1,000, and there are 1,000 games out there waiting to be played, you're going to get a ton of data, and that's going to be slow. So you kind of have to decide, how big of a weight, and you're probably going to have to, just test this empirically, but how big of a weight are you willing to have to load in games? And plus, you're going to have to show all those, so that's going to take a bunch of time too to set up the display for all those. But we do give you the option of choosing how many games max you want to receive. Now, of course, if there's less than that, we'll just send you whatever we got. So, if only 5 people currently have games that are still waiting for players to join, then we'll just send you 5, even though you requested 10. The other 2 fields that are important are the game type and the game subtype. These are just arbitrary strings, but what happens is when a game gets created, you set a game type and a game subtype string. And you want to have, if you want to filter based on those values, then you can set those in game subtype in NetworkGames. So for instance, if let's say I've got my games set up like based on ranking. So I have expert games and normal games and easy games. I can set up my game type as expert, normal, or easy. And then when I filter those, I could ask my player, do you want to get a list of expert games or easy games or normal games? And I can set that in the game type, and then you'll only get a list of those particular games. So that way you have filters that you can use. And we have 2 different filters, as I said. There's type, subtype. Again, these are totally arbitrary, don't have anything to do with anything you've set up. As far as on the PlaysTogether website, doesn't have to match your game name. They're just arbitrary strings, but we can use these as matching values to filter the list of games that you receive, so you don't just get flooded out. There is one caveat note, and that's very important when getting open games, in that we can't exclude based on player ID, which means that if you get open games, it may return games that the player currently is playing that are still waiting. So what you're going to have to do when showing the list of games is basically go through and say, is the current player playing this game? Is he on the player list? And if he is, then you might want to filter that out or color it in a different color or something like that, so he doesn't join a game he's currently playing. So that's something I'd like to fix in the future, although there are currently no plans for it, but something to keep in mind. So once these commands are run, and assuming the callback is one, the server is going to fill in the network game instances table with all the games that match the criteria that you set up in the network games behavior. This again is another slide that's going to be maybe kind of hard to see on your screen. You can magnify it once we post the slides. But this is the network game instances table. As you can see, it's just got a ton of data, and this isn't even all the data on here. This is only showing the data for the base data and the first 2 players. So there's other fields for the other 6 players here as well. But basically, this is just for every row here is a game that's been created. And the most important thing really about this is the leftmost column, which is the game instance ID. Every game that gets created is assigned an ID. And that ID uniquely identifies that game. And you're going to be passing that ID around to a lot of the behaviors so that it knows that, hey, I'm talking about this particular game that's being played and not that game over there that's being played. I'm not really going to go over the data for the rest of them. But I will want to note that there is a known bug on the player name _1, player name _2, etc. in that the name for the player that is using the device is correct. It will give that player's name that he connected with. However, other players, it will simply say user 1, user 2, user 3, etc. That is a known bug that we will be fixing in the future before we officially release this. So, so that's that table. So if there are no games at all, the player is obviously going to want to create a game for themselves. And you use that with the network create game behavior. It's got several fields, 2 of which we've already talked about, the game type and game subtype. Again, these are arbitrary strings, and they're strictly used for matchmaking when you request games. So it doesn't matter what you put in there. It won't be used for anything unless you decide to use it. If the game, if the game subtype is important to your game, to maybe set the difficulty level or whatever, you can you look at that field. But other than that, as far as we're concerned, it's just basically a string that we pass around. The important thing to note is max players. That can be a number from 1 to 8. Admittedly, a 1-player multiplayer game is a little weird, but it's technically doable. However, one thing to note is that for max players, for a game to be started, all those players have to have joined the game. So you can't have a game that you've said max players is 4, and 2 people have joined the game and have those 2 people play. You can't join ad hoc. You have to have all the players join before the game can be started. So keep that in mind, is that you set up an 8-player game, whoever creates the game is going to have to wait around for 7 other people to join before the game can even get started. And just keep that in mind, and for when you're designing your game. The other field that's very important for this is the initialization table. You're going to set that with a table. It can be any table that's available that you created. And that table, when this command is run and it's run successfully, is going to be copied into network player game data _x. So if the person creating the game is almost always player 1. So in general, that will be copied into network player game data _1. There may be there's no guarantee, however, of that. So you don't want to actually set data directly into network player game data _1 for the creator. Set it up in an initialization table. Set that table in the expression or the attribute for the initialization table, and we'll copy that for you into the correct table. And then once that gets done, that data gets sent to the server so that the server now can send that data to other players, so the other players will be able to see that data. But that's very important, is that do not directly initialize network player game data underscore X. Now, of course, if you don't want to have any data per player, then you can leave this blank, and nothing will get initialized, and it will effectively be ignored. You know, leaving it blank is a valid thing. So once a person has created a game, other people are going to want to join it. And join is actually used for two different things. Join is used for, you created a game and I want to join your game so I can play. But join is also used for, I've been playing a game and I've turned off my device and now I've come back in and I want to continue playing this game. You also have to call join in that situation. So join is called when you're joining a game for the first time, and every time you come back into the game once you've left and want to continue playing that. So you're going to want to call it every time that the player starts up. You're going to want to pass in, whoops, stupid thing. You're going to want to pass in the game ID of the game being joined. And you're going to want to, again, with the other one, with the create one, pass in an initialization table. This is only used if the player is joining a new game. If it turns out that you called join game for a player that the game has joined previously, then the initialization table field will simply be ignored, because that their network player game data underscore X table has already been initialized, and so we actually want to get that data from the server and not from your initialization table. And that's actually what we see here. On a successful join from the server, a bunch of data is going to come in for that player. They're going to get the network game data, which is the global data for the particular game. They're going to get any game tables that you created that are flagged as network game tables. And they're going to get all the network player game data X tables. So they'll be able to see the individual data for all the players that are currently in the game. Now, assuming that the network join game callback attribute returns 1, you've got some decisions to make. There's basically four things that can happen, assuming that a game is joined successfully. You're going to want to look at the attributes for the game, and you're going to want to see, is the game started attribute set? If it's not set, you need to see, is the player count equal to the maximum number of players for the game? If it's not, then you need to wait for more players to join the game until all the players are joined. So you're going to need to pop up a message to the user saying, waiting for X number of players, please be patient, or come back later until the number of players is joined. Again, currently we do not have push notifications. So if you have a 4-player game and player number 2 is joined, and they don't feel like waiting around, they're just going to have to come back later and see, have enough people join the game yet. And again, hopefully we'll be able to get push notifications in the next few months, and so that way they'll get a notification saying, hey, everybody's joined the game, and now the game can go on. If the player count is equal to the max number of players for the game, then you are going to want to start the game up, and we'll get to that in a second. If you've just the game started flag, and the game has started, you've still got two different options. Is the current player my player? If it is, then have the player take his turn. The player should be able to modify the game, however, move his piece, roll the dice, whatever. If the current player is not my player, simply show the player state, but don't let the player actually input any data or try to change the state, because what's going to happen is that periodically his game is going to go out and request the game data, and it's going to update the game data from the server. There's actually a bug, a known bug, where the current player who's taking their turn also gets overwritten. And again, that's a known bug that will be fixed soon. But that's not supposed to happen, so wait for that. So kind of the two big things are, if the game is started and the players count equals the max number of players, you're going to want to start the game. If the game has started and the current player is spy player, you're going to want the player to take his turn. Those are the two big things. And then otherwise, you're going to want to just simply show the game state, or simply tell the player that not all the players have joined the game yet, and they have to wait. So, if the game hasn't started, but the number of players equals the max number of players, you're going to go on and call it the start game here. Now, technically, the final person that joined the game doesn't have to call start game. It could be, you could wait and have the creator join the game, and if he sees the number of players equals max number of players, he'll start the game. But in general, it's best to start the game as soon as possible, so that, you know, if it's a 4-player game and player 4 joins, the game starts right off the bat. And it's a smoother game flow that way. But again, it's not technically necessary. However, to start this game, the player must have successfully called join game. So if you want the creator of the game to be the one to start the game, and he's created the game, logged off, logged back on again at a later point, you need to make sure that he, even though he's the creator, he still has to call join game, say that yes, this is the game that I'm interested in using, and then he can call start game. But in general, the last player to do it, it's an easier flow. So all you have to do there is simply say, enter in the ID of the first player. You can enter it. You can be, the person that just last joined the game, and that's also a smoother flow, so that the person that last joined the game can immediately take their turn. But if you want to make it so that the creator is always the first player to go, then you can put in the creator's ID. Or if you want to make it random, you can get a list of the player IDs from the game instance table, and pick a random one and stick that in there. One thing to note is that if callback attributes returns -1 and last error is -8, that means the player has not joined. So you should, in theory, you should never see this. You should never have -8 as the last error. But if you do, that's what that means. And what's going to happen on network start game is the network game data table and any network game tables that you personally create will immediately be sent to the server. So whoever calls the start game should have those tables set up for them. So you can have it set up, statically when you actually create the game in Creator, or you can set it dynamically so that when the last player joins, you dynamically add data to game data and to any tables that you create, and then call start game. But those will be sent to the server initially, and then those tables will then be sent to any other players that are currently in the game. So once a player has started the game, current player will be set to whoever the current player is, and that player will be able to take their turn. You're going to, let them roll dice or move pieces or make attacks or whatever, and you're going to be modifying various data tables. There are some tables you should not modify. The network player game data _ X tables for other players, do not modify those, because those will be overwritten by receiving data. So do not modify those. That data will never get sent to the server, and it will basically be overwritten periodically. Do not modify network game instances or network game achievements. Basically, never modify network game instances and network achievements at all. Those two tables are always built in with data from the server. However, you can modify any of the other network tables. So you can modify the global game data table. You can modify any of your own personal game data tables. You can modify the network player game data table for the player whose current is. And of course, you can modify the network player data table that's global to the player, not for a particular game that they're currently playing, but just their global data. Now, as I said, you can modify network player game data for my current player. How do I do that? As I showed earlier, there's a new function called network player table for ID, and you just put in game.networking.player ID, and that's the current player. So if you need to, set a cell and the set cell function, you'll pass this in as the table. If you want to get cell, again, you'll pass this in to that behavior to get that data. If you want to get the data for the current player, you want to have some other player see what the current player's state is, then you can use game networking current player in that function. And if you want to just get an arbitrary player, you can basically do a double function where you call network player table for ID and then pass into that network player ID for number and then the numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so you can use all these three functions as a substitute for a table in any place where you would need to enter in a table. Once the current player has gotten done with his particular turn, you need to pass that turn on to the next player, and you do that by calling end turn. And you simply pass in the player ID of the player whose next turn is. You want to go in however you determine the player order, random or whatever. You pass in that ID, and that once this function executes, that player will be the current player. And again, once this function executes successfully, some of the tables on the current player's device will be sent to the server. So the network game data table on his device, and your personal network tables, and the network player game data for that player will all be sent to the server, and then all that will be updated on other players' devices. So basically what that means is that while a player is taking his turn, other players won't be able to see the updates. So if your game allows the player to do multiple things in one turn, the other players won't be able to see the results of that until they've done all those things and you've called end turn. That's very important to note. So in a game like, let's say, Words for Friends, it doesn't matter because you play a tile and that's all you do. So you play a tile, you hit end turn, and the other player sees what tile you played. But if you, for instance, roll dice and make a move, the other players won't be able to see what dice value were rolled until you've actually called end turn and also sent the move itself. So you can't have multiple pieces of data updating independently of each other. You've got to send the player's entire turn as one set of data. So that's important to note when designing your game. And that's actually kind of the entire loop. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to call network end turn. Somebody is going to get an update saying that current player is now my player ID, so then they take their turn, and then the next player takes their turn and calls end turn, and so on and so on and so forth, until somebody wins the game. And in that case, you'll call network end game, and set the winner, and the game will be over. So these are kind of the other commands. I'm just going to go over these very quickly and not in any particular detail. So network end game, again, all you do is it's called when the game is over. You set you set the winner of the game, and then the players know who won the game. Network leave game is called, it's kind of an optional function. You don't necessarily need to call it, but it's a kind of a, basically it's kind of a convenience function. If that you have multiple people playing and they're all online, and one of them decides to, go out and do other things, you can call network leave game just to notify other players that, hey, this guy is offline. But it doesn't actually cause them to quit or anything like that. You can also call network leave game. Oh, never mind, that's a network extender. So that's kind of if they want to, like, for instance, leave the game and join another game, you can call a network leave game to do that. So, for instance, if I'm playing multiple instances of Word for Friends, I can go and make a move on one game, then have it sort of call leave game, and then join another particular game. Network quit game is called, you can call that if the player literally just simply says, I don't want to play this game anymore, and you can have call quit game and send the player ID. And once that happens, even though you can't start a game until all players are joined, when a player quits the game, you can still play the game with less players. So, for instance, if you have a 4-player game, all 4 players have to join the game before the game starts, but then if one of them quits and your game can handle it, the other 3 players could still potentially continue playing the game. However, no one will be able to join as the 4th player. So you can't have one person leave a game and another person then join in as a substitute for that player.
There's a question that will know the scroll. If I exit the app, will I, the player, count as a quitter?
No. No. Exiting out is the equivalent of leaving the game. It is not quitting the game. Network persist player. I've talked about the data tables that are assigned to the player globally, the player data table that aren't associated with any particular instance of a game. I showed how those were loaded in when the player first connects to the network, but I never said anything about how you actually send that data to the server. That's the network persist player function. So you call that, and those global tables are sent to the server to be stored, so that the next time the player connects to the server, they'll get that data back. Network send message sends a message, just a text string to another player. You can use that to send arbitrary data, or you could use it to make a little chat system for your game. However you want to use it, it's there. Network delete game is used to remove a game from the system. One thing, it can be used to delete a game in progress, which admittedly is kind of rude, but nevertheless we allow you to do it. Or it can delete a game that's finished. One thing to note is that when a game ends, that game data sticks around essentially forever, unless we decide to delete it on the server, but which ideally we should never do unless we just totally run out of data. However, if the player that created the game ends, the player that created the game has the option of deleting the game, and which will delete all its data as well. Note that only the creator of a particular instance of a game can delete that game. So if even though someone else might be playing the game, if they call delete game, the callback will return a -1 because they aren't the creator of the game. Network change password is the one we talked about in the beginning. If a user logs in and decides they don't like their password, they can change it, but they can't recover it. And hopefully we'll get that fixed at some point in the future. Network get server time is that attribute that we talked about earlier, so you can get a consistent time between players. But again, that's mainly used to determine delta times, so that you can say, this player has been playing his turn for 60 seconds, and maybe you want to assign a penalty to that. Because we didn't have the server time, they could potentially go in and just set their clock back, and then all of a sudden when you check the local time, it would say the same time as the last time you checked it, even though, a minute had passed. So you can use kind of network server time to prevent not total cheating, but potentially a little cheating there. So you can make sure that you say, you must make your turn within 1 minute. You can verify the 1 minute's passed. Network update achievements is to assign players to it for a particular achievement, but we're not going to do it. We're not talking about achievements in this talk. Network disconnect is an interesting one. So network disconnect basically not only is the equivalent of calling leave game, but it also removes the cache data from their login. So as I said earlier, when you first start your game, you want to call connect with no data, so it will use the cache data so that they don't have to re-enter their name and email and password every time they want to play your game. Network disconnect basically gets rid of that cache. It deletes it, so that next time they play, they do have to enter in their name and their email and their password. In general, the only time you want to call network disconnect is if a player is going to want to give his device to some other person and doesn't want that person logging in as them, and so you want to call disconnect to make sure that the other person can't auto log in as the other player, or if they want to just pass their device and have some other player log in, because you may want this, depending on how you set up your game, you may have it set up so that if the auto login succeeds, you may not give them the option to manually log in. So network disconnect could be used for that as well. But basically, yeah, that just deletes the internal cache of their login data so that the next time they run your game, they must re-enter in their login data. And that is actually the end of the talk. I know it's been a lot of information coming in fairly quickly. Hopefully, most of it made sense. If not, we'll be posting, when we do the official release of the PlaysTogether stuff, we'll be posting a detailed information about all these commands and all the data that goes along with it. And of course, we'll be posting these slides and an audio log of the talk as well. So hopefully you can just go re-listen to it and re-look at the slides and kind of get your head around it.
All right, so that's it. Thanks for coming to Meetup.
Thanks very much.
Yep, next month. Thank you, Steve, for giving a great presentation on PlaysTogether.
And we'll get the audio and the slides up as soon as we can.
Yeah, and send me issues with multiplayer stuff. I'll try to get those higher up in the queue, get someone to fix those. Next week we'll be talking about the IAP system and how to do really cool things with the new. Next month we'll be talking about how to do the really cool stuff with the new IAP system, and we'll have our second user presentation. And if you guys want to present, please let me know. I'm always looking for more presenters and more topics. Also, if you're in Dallas, there's a Dallas Meetup group this month. 13th is that what it is? Yeah. Yeah, so if you're in Dallas, go say hi to those guys. Or if you want to have a meetup in your area, let me know. We have if you want to host a GameStop meetup in your area, we can give you access to announcing those meetups on our meetup group and in the forums. So come email me and let me know if you guys will do that. So thanks everyone for coming to this month's meetup.